Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to our World Trade Report 2022 webinar series on trade and climate change. Today, we have two excellent panelists, Professor Bernard Sinclair de Gagné from the Schema Business School and University of the Côte d'Azur, and Professor Tatiana Manilova from Bentley University. We're doing this in collaboration with our Trade and Environment Division in the context of this forthcoming World Trade Report. It's our annual flagship publication, which offers detailed analysis of a trade-related topic chosen for its high policy relevance. And certainly trade and climate change is very much up there on policy relevance these days. So the objective of the webinars are to ensure we have an informed debate on the role of international trade in the development, adaptation, and diffusion of environmental technologies and eco-innovation. Environmental technologies and eco-innovations are key elements to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and to help adapt to climate change. Trade can also play a key role by providing access to environmental technologies with a level of efficiency that cannot always be replicated domestically. Addressing trade barriers to environmental goods and services embodying environmental technologies can therefore be important to the development and dissemination of environmental technologies. So we have these two distinguished speakers from academia with deep experience on trade and environmental technology. Our speakers will deliver their personal insights regarding the role of trade in environmental technologies. Each speaker will have 15 to 20 minutes to deliver their presentation. Following the presentations, I'll open the floor up for questions and comments from the audience as compiled from the chat box. So I'd like to now invite Professor Sinclair de Gagné to share his insights on the role of trade in environmental goods and services industry. The floor is now yours.
Thank you, Dr. Koopman. I will share my slides. Thank you very much to you, Dr. Koopman, and also to your team for inviting me to this webinar and organizing it. So as you said, I'm going to speak about trade and the eco-industry. As an introduction, well, as we all know, the spaceship Earth is not doing so well. Quoting the last IPCC report, the cumulative scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health. Any further delay in concerted anticipatory global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. This is about climate change, but of course there are other very important environmental problems nowadays. Think of waste, especially plastic waste. Think of air pollution, notably in large cities in developing countries. This one's from India. Think of contaminated sites, old industrial sites in all the world. Think of the overexploitation still of fossil fuels in areas where biodiversity is endangered by this activity. Think of in agriculture pesticides and so on. There comes the environmental goods and services industry, as it was defined in 1999 by the OECD and Eurostat. The environmental industry consists of activities which produce goods and services to measure, prevent, limit, minimize, or correct environmental damage to water, air, and soil, as well as problems related to waste, noise, and ecosystems. These include cleaner technologies, products and services which reduce environmental risk and minimize pollution and resource use, although there is currently no agreed methodology which allows their contribution to be measured in a satisfactory way. I will come back very shortly on this last assertion. Of course, this you look at some of the technologies that are provided for waste treatment, wastewater sanitization, for renewable energy and site remediation, for instance. All right, and of course, it's natural then to foster trade in such environmental goods and services. This is what the World Trade Organization did since over the past, more than 10 years. asserting that lowering barriers to trade in these types of products will reduce their price and make them more accessible. Increased competition will foster technological innovation in areas related to protection of the environment and climate change. Well, but what are the challenge? What are the challenges? And this is the outline of my talk. Related to this, what is exactly the environmental goods and services industry? Then how can international trade contribute to the development, adaptation, and diffusion of environmental goods and services? And then finally, how can environmental goods and services themselves contribute to make international trade more widely accepted, I should say? And I'll finish on this. Okay, first thing, what is the eco-industry? What are its characteristics and so on? Well, first of all, it's a young industry. Already 1998, in a report to the US Department of Commerce, Berg, Furrier, and Pauth asserted that the domestic industry that provides environmental products and services is one of the least understood sectors within American industry, despite its size and economic importance. The definition I just quoted from the OECD came afterwards to try to actually define and therefore get a better grasp at this industry and, as a consequence, understand it better and have better policies. It has been and still is a very fast-growing industry, which is now quite big in revenue. It's actually the third in the world in overall revenues. You have here some figures that date back to 2012 is the last year, but you can see what I want to show here is the tremendous growth that it experienced early on. It's above world growth all the time, and it is below. It's also above world growth when it is negative. You can see that after 2007, 2008. Crisis. Well, first of all, the effect of this came later, a year later, as far as the eco industry is concerned. It was certainly not as sharp as in many other industries. All right. So now, as I said, it's third in the world in overall revenues. It is also highly, and that's important for any kind of policy. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. It's a highly segmented industry. Here you have three main segments: equipment, services, and resources. And within, for instance, equipment, you have water equipment. You have also equipments for air pollution control. In services, you have services for solid waste management, for hazardous waste. Consulting and engineering is a segment that is growing very, very fast nowadays. And in resources, of course, an important segment is the one on clean energy systems and power. There are sub-segments of those segments. For instance, the air pollution control itself is highly sub-segmented because there are various types of air pollutants, and each one faces its own regulation, which makes it quite complex as an industry to analyze, okay? This is what I told you also about this sector. Consulting and engineering nowadays is a sector, although it's environmental services, that is growing very, very fast. Okay. It's also increasingly global, which makes it very relevant for this webinar, for trade in general. Look at the growth of exports of environmental goods with respect to total merchandise exports in the 1990s decade, for instance. And so it grew much faster. Exports in environmental goods grew much, much faster. More recently, you have those figures here. Trade went slightly down as far as developed countries are concerned, but it kept going up and increase in developing countries, although there are still significant barriers to trade, as you know. Here is also you have the share also, because as I said, it's a segmented industry. What you can see is that overall, around 2006-07, there was a sharp increase in exports of environmental goods and services, and well, the increase was particularly sharp in percentage, I would say, in developing countries. The sector where that has seen the sharpest increase in developing countries is the sector of cleaner resources. You can see it; it's the light green in the left graph, light green thing. All right. Another characteristic of it is that it is, and that's important also for what comes in the what will be coming in this short talk. It's industry made of a few large firms with a significant competitive fringe of smaller entrepreneurs, which I'm sure Tatiana will speak about after me. So it's an oligopoly with a competitive fringe. When you hear oligopoly, monopoly, and so on, that should ring a bell. That means there's the possibility of market power there. And that's coming soon. Well, before that, it's also an industry that is big in employment. You have some figures here that show you employment in 2015 in a few countries. You can see, for instance, that you have millions of employees in that industry, direct jobs created in this industry. Actually, it employs overall more people than the car industry, both in the United States and in Europe, which is very significant. And that's key. It's an industry that is strongly policy driven. Here you have a graph that shows you the relationship between environmental policy stringency and the comparative advantage, well, meaning the size, effectiveness of the eco industry, and you can see that the relationship is positive and linear. Okay. Now, I want to say something that policy discussions often forget. And I want to stress it. Oh, before I go this, of course, this has been also verified empirically. There is, among others, a very well-known paper by De Mello and Solander showing and arguing about the importance of policy for the development of this industry. All right. Again, what I want to stress here is something else also. I want to, that each environmental policy instrument, be them, emission taxes, tradable permits, voluntary approaches, and so on, affects not only the size of demand for EGS, which is what everyone, is aware of, but also, and differently, and that's important, the price elasticity of demand. That is basically the sensitivity of consumers to prices. For those of you trained in economics, I mentioned earlier that the industry is dominated by a few large firms. It's some kind of an oligopoly. When demand is not price elastic, that means that those oligopolistic firms can use market power to raise prices, which raises the cost of using environmental goods and services. Okay. Now, I forgot to say, but those oligopolies exist because they are in several segments, very important economies of scale. Think of waste management, for instance, which means that firms tend to be big in those industries. Now, reinforcing this point about price elasticity to convey it perhaps more clearly, a polluting firm subject to a technical standard, for instance, will be much less sensitive to the price charged by its abatement suppliers than if it can choose between paying some extra taxes versus further lowering its emissions by acquiring certain technologies. So, as you can see, we are here comparing two policies, a standard versus a tax, and the tax would make demand for environmental goods and services less price sensitive, okay, and therefore less subject to the exercise of market power. I will come back to that point because this is important. Now, it's an industry that is also very innovative. You can see the share of overall patents in 2009. It spends on average 3% of its total revenue on R&D. I want here perhaps to make a personal conjecture, which again, I think matters for trade. Innovation here is not so much of a Schumpeterian type, that is creative destruction, that is basically new technologies replacing old ones. It's a young industry, remember. And some of these technologies do not have older ones to compete with in many cases. So innovation is not so much a creative destruction phenomenon. It's not so much driven by this. It is rather driven by the fact that since demand for those goods is expanding, that justifies increasingly the entry of new firms, specializing on delivering environmental goods and services. And it is this specialization, this new enhanced division of labor, that actually leads to more and more innovation. We speak here of a Smithian innovation. It dates back to Adam Smith, and this is actually the type of innovation that is also related to, it's very much present in trade. When you say trade fosters growth through each country's taking advantage, specializing where it has comparative advantage. Basically, what we expect there is that specialization will entail more and more innovation. Finally, since it is big in employment, big in revenue, innovative, and so on, then it's now a frequent target for industrial policy. You can see here, on that slide, there are examples of government agencies in a few countries that have explicit policies to try to promote exports in environmental goods and services industry. The same thing holds in the United States. That's a document that's from a document from the U.S. Department of Commerce, 2019, on top markets report. It's a term, on environmental technologies. All right. Second item I want to speak about now: how can international trade contribute to the development, adaptation, and diffusion of environmental goods and services? Well, here are the characteristics I've been listing for this industry. Certainly, since it's young and fast growing, then, and that's what most of the problem lies in negotiations to liberalize the sector, there are no consensual definitions and classifications. Well, agreements and agreements on trade liberalization would certainly lead to more precise consensual definitions and classification. And what's the benefit of that is that we would get more abundant, comparable, and accessible data. You might have noticed that some of the charts I've shown right now come from private companies that study the eco-industry. They collect good data, certainly, but that data is not so accessible, and it is expensive. And certainly having, again, more consensual definitions would lead to having more and more precise data. The point is made in a policy brief here. Now, since it's innovative also, of course, and that's the Smith-Stigler theorem, the division of labor, hence Smithian innovation, is limited by the extent of the market, meaning that the larger the market, again, the more specialists you may get, and the more specialists you may get, the more focused your managers are, then the more innovation you get. But there are some caveats here. Oops, sorry. One is that the outcome is likely to vary a lot across industry segments, since it is highly segmented. Second, since it's an oligopoly, who will really benefit from trade? Would it be entrepreneurs, local entrepreneurs, or would it be large multinationals? And finally, again, I would like to stress that how will environmental policy adjust and ultimately impact innovation? Because remember, it is largely policy driven. All right, so yes, now coming back to the relationship between environmental policy and its impact on EGS international markets, well, such policies might create barriers to imports. It's been established both theoretically and empirically that softer empirical environmental policies are a substitute for non-tariff trade barriers, which is quite peculiar and specific, I would say, characteristic of this industry. Those countries that were kind of led into liberalizing environmental goods and services might not want their own polluting industries to give their money away to foreign multinationals providing environmental goods and services. One way to not do this is to soften their environmental policies. On the other hand, also, too stringent environmental policies might actually lead to less imports. How? Because when you have more stringent and too stringent environmental policies, remember the market power story, the price of environmental goods and services will go up, and therefore their consumption might actually end up going down, okay? At least not be at the level that you would have expected from liberalizing. And that's the price elasticity effect, which is written there. But a regulation could also create barriers to exports. And again, this is peculiar to this industry because sometimes environmental regulations are inconsistent and might favor the status quo. Here I can share with you a case. That's a tidal turbine that was designed to basically being put in the beds of rivers. It's a tiny tidal turbine. It's meant to basically provide electricity to remote locations. Now, the problem is that in order to install that turbine, you need authorizations in Canada, at least, because the riverbeds are protected to protect biodiversity. To get such authorization is so complicated that, well, you know, those remote communities would keep using power generators like these small generators that use diesel, gasoline, fossil fuel, and they are extremely polluting. But at least, you know, they don't have to go through the hassles of getting authorizations, okay? So, you know, harmonizing environmental regulations might be also important to benefit from trade liberalization. Finally, one has to understand also how does innovation occur in those industries. Very briefly here, it's been acknowledged since countries have been relating on market instruments, which again increase the elasticity of demand for services. Therefore, the clients of environmental companies were not captive anymore, as I said. And that led those companies, those environmental goods and services company, to actually value more, tend to, since they don't have captive consumers anymore, they must insist on co-creating values with their clients. And this is perhaps the cycle that we went in. In the early 1990s, polluters were sort of captive of their abatement suppliers, but with the use of market instruments, demand sort of plateaued, at least in the United States or in Europe, and then to send the industry, the environmental goods and services industry, back into strong growth, they had to reflect on ways they can actually co-create value with polluting firms through relational exchanges. And that needs to be fostered, of course, if you want to benefit fully from the liberalization of trade. Now, last, how can NGSs contribute themselves to international trade? Well, they can through, for instance, what are the potential benefits? First of all, by making greener global value chains better, by making global value chains greener, they might actually make trade more acceptable. There are lots of resistance nowadays from the population. It's not protectionism; it's the fear of by citizens that you will face a race to the bottom. By lowering compliance costs also, you would improve societies because compliance costs are responsible for greater enforcement costs, adversarial relationships between regulating agencies and regulated, I would say wasteful influence and lobbying activities, corruption, white-collar crime, and what have you. When I said enhanced trade acceptability, well, you know, when you deal better with the environment, also that contributes to better, greater public health. And as I said earlier, also less of a race to the bottom. If compliance costs are reasonable, that means that you do not need to soften your regulations, which again makes trade more acceptable to the public. But there are some pitfalls, okay, which are that there could be trade imbalances. That's a big concern in current negotiations. Most of those multinationals are from developed countries, except for the Chinese ones. There could actually be not greener, but browner global value chains. Why? Because there could be more trade in waste. And as I said earlier, also that in some countries, environmental regulation might become softer. Because again, softer environmental regulation is a substitute for non-trade barriers. And there might be social problems as usual. In this case, unemployment. Remember, this industry is big in employment. Think of waste management. In developing countries, the informal sector is very active in this. If you rely on multinationals now to treat solid waste, then these people might go unemployed with tremendous social consequences. The whole issue of environmental justice also could be raised. I think I'm out of time. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bernard. A very interesting presentation, very insightful data. We have a number of questions that have come in, but we'll come to those at the end. One of the questions though, I think is maybe useful for you to reflect on before we come back to them, and that is there a way to get more updated data? Some of the data seems to be a bit dated. All right, so thank you, Bernard. Now let's go immediately to Professor Manilova, and her focus, the discussion that she'll focus on is the role of eco-innovations in firms engaged in trade, with some emphasis on micro and small, medium-sized enterprises.
Thank you, Bob, for giving me this opportunity to present at today's webinar, and for the kind introduction. And in my presentation, I will try to build on Bernard's discussion on the role of trade for environmental goods and services by offering the perspective of a management and entrepreneurship scholar. And I would like to focus in particular on eco-innovation in small and medium-sized enterprises. Because why the focus on small and medium-sized enterprises? These are very important players and contributors to the world economy. They represent over 90% of the business population. They offer over 60% of GDP in developed economies, more than 70% of GDP in the emerging and developing countries. And they also account for over a third of world exports. So I would like to focus on these often overlooked players, the competitive fringe, as Bernard referred to in these oligopolistic industries, and what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, what are the policy implications of eco-innovation in this context. So what I'll talk about today is briefly introduce eco-innovation, what it is, the drivers, benefits, challenges, and then focus more on the virtuous circle between SME internationalization and eco-innovation, completing with some policy implications. I also want to give credit to my co-authors, Jana Hojnik and Mitja Ruzier at the University of Primorska, Slovenia, as most of the findings that I will be discussing today are based on our joint work. So what is eco-innovation? Some things that probably come to mind are that A, this is innovation, so this is something that is new to the firm or to the user, and it is also good for the environment. And the quotes that I'm showing on that slide are from a survey of policymakers and entrepreneurs from different countries in the European Union. More specifically, if we take a look at the formal definition, we should note that the notion of eco-innovation has evolved from a focus on a good service, production process, organizational structure that is new to the firm and good to the environment, such as, for example, using solar energy or using recyclable packaging or reducing the energy consumption of the product, to a more holistic view of how sustainability can be incorporated in the entire business model and across the value chain. So as you can see on that graph to the right of the slide, the definition of eco-innovation has expanded. Here are a couple of examples. From our field work in Slovenia, a company called Clara One is providing a water recycling system for commercial laundry rooms. The device collects the wastewater, puts it through a filtration system to clean it up, and then reuses it. So these laundries save water, energy, money, do not pollute the environment with toxic wastewater, including the very dangerous microplastic pollutants. Even though the company is still a startup, very much a startup, it's looking at markets in the European Union, such as Germany, France, or Spain. From a completely different country in the world, from a completely different context, Cali, Colombia, Naturres, established 2010 by Natalia Osorio. I'm particularly proud because I do a lot of research on women entrepreneurs. So this is a company that is producing cosmetics, mostly or initially and mostly directed at hotel chains. And it was also a participant in the 2014 United Nations Environmental Program's Global Eco-Innovation Project, and I'll talk more about it later. So the company has infused sustainability throughout the value chain by using sustainability certified raw materials, paper packaging from local sugarcane, and a very interesting innovation. They do collect those half-used or unused bar soap that we are all familiar with from hotel rooms, and then reuse them into liquid detergent manufacturing. They've grown quite well, and they also are using a direct-to-consumer channel through their online store. So what are some of the drivers of SME eco-innovation? By looking at the chart to the left that summarizes those, we can think of them as both push factors and pull factors. On the push side, the adaptation and the trying to preempt and better adapt to different risk factors such as resource scarcity or price volatility of raw materials, as well as the regulatory pressures that Bernard also discussed that are particularly onerous for small players. That's on the push side. On the pull side, however, there are the changing market conditions and the growing consumer preferences and awareness of the importance of environmentally sustainable goods and services and environmentally friendly products. So what's interesting about the SME context is that SMEs, particularly those in emerging markets, they're by definition resource poor because they're small. And so they operate in very resource thin environments. They're very vulnerable to exogenous shocks, as the COVID pandemic also demonstrated. And they are, going back to regulations, they are disproportionately burdened by regulatory pressures because the cost of compliance is a very steep fixed cost in terms of both money and managerial time. And both of these resources, particularly managerial time, are in particularly short supply in SMEs. On the more positive side, SMEs are more flexible in response to market conditions because they're closer to the market and more in tune with customers' changing needs, which leads us to a lot of the benefits from eco-innovation. The first one, and you can notice that a lot of these benefits have a very strong international component. Reaching new markets, both directly through domestic market expansion and through exporting, as well as indirectly through improved access to M&E's supply chains. A very popular example is Walmart and the environmental sustainability mandates for its suppliers. Perhaps the most intuitive benefit from eco-innovation is generating efficiencies from better resource use, being lean and green. Also, attracting financial support, investment both domestically and internationally, a lot of channels of financial support, government grants, as we saw in the case of Clara One. It had received funding from the European Institute of Innovation and Technology, from the Climate Knowledge and Innovation Community. Also, crowdfunding and donation-based platforms such as Kickstarter or Indiegogo have quite a lot of environmentally friendly entrepreneurial ventures listed on them. Impact investment from both venture capital and angel investors that are directed at growth, early stage growth financing. There are some estimates that put the value of investment into environmentally friendly companies or companies that clearly specify their environmental, social, and governance ESG goals as up to 25% or 1 in 4 in every investment dollar. Also, corporate partnerships. A recent example is the $100 million Starbucks Community Resilience Fund that is focused on supporting small businesses and community development. And last but not least, exit through mergers and acquisitions. For example, a very popular brand on the shelves of some natural food stores, such as Whole Foods in the United States, is EcoVer. EcoVer is actually a Belgian company that is another graduate of the United Nations Environmental Program Global Eco Innovation Project that was acquired in 2012 by Method, a US manufacturer of environmentally friendly cleaning products, which in turn was acquired in 2017 by SC Johnson, one of the largest producers of household cleaning products. So that is on the positive side. On the negative side, and it's interesting that in the context of SMEs, a lot of the factors can act as both drivers and barriers to SME eco-innovation: resource constraints, uncertain demand, and hence uncertain return on investment, inadequate innovation capabilities, lack of managerial capacity, and also something that is very critical is the lack of access to open innovation networks, and also the inability to derive and capture value from these open innovation networks, something that is illustrated in the figure to the left, used on an example from the Danish maritime industry. And this is also something that Bernard referred to, the oligopolistic market situation and the imbalance in market power. So a lot of drivers, a lot of benefits, but also a lot of challenges. What is the bottom line? So overall, how beneficial is eco-innovation to SME performance? We did a study in Slovenian SMEs looking at different types of eco-innovation and also different types of firms, more generally innovative SMEs versus more traditional SMEs. And we found that the effect of eco-innovation was not universal. Organizational eco-innovation was very positively associated with efficiency, which was our measure of performance in both innovative and less innovative companies, whereas process eco-innovation was only beneficial for the more innovative companies, and product eco-innovation was not associated with efficiency in either one of the groups. This finding is consistent with the results of a study in the context of Taiwanese firms, and it goes to show once again something that was, I believe, also emphasized in the previous WTO webinar on how important behavioral factors and the culture of the company is. Whenever there are organizational practices that systematically look at infusing sustainability, the result on performance is quite positive. Also, going back to the United Nations Environmental Program's Global Eco-Innovation project, in which they recruited, and they have 45 companies participating in this project between 2012 and 2017 in 8 countries across three continents. They went back in 2021 to check on how their graduates were doing. And that, of course, happened to be at the height of the pandemic. They did find that these companies that were engaged in ecosystemic eco-innovation were more resilient to the COVID-19 pandemic, which I think is an extra benefit from eco-innovation. So how can internationalization help eco-innovation and performance? We did a study, we were wondering about that. So we did this survey-based study of 151 Slovenian internationalized companies. We expected that internationalization would be positively associated with eco-innovation, which in turn will be positively associated with a firm performance. So that was a mediated model in which eco-innovation translates the positive effects of internationalization into firm performance, and the model was supported in our statistical tests. So what was the logic in us arguing that internationalization would be positively associated with eco-innovations? 3 major channels, mechanisms of influence. The first one being the growing market demand worldwide for environmentally sustainable production technologies, products, and services. The global market for environmental goods and services is estimated to reach over 2.2 trillion euros, was estimated. As the world trade recovers from the disruptions in global supply chains, hopefully we'll be on target in achieving this goal. The second one is more of a push factor. Foreign regulation, the so-called green barriers to exporting that Bernard also referred to. Regulations such as ISO 14001, which sets out a number of requirements for a company's environmental management system. And last but not least, critically important, learning by exporting. So there are different ways to learn from exporting. SMEs learn as they cater to demanding foreign customers. They learn from observing capable foreign competitors. And they also learn from collaborating with technologically advanced foreign partners. So these were our 3 major reasons why we expected and hypothesized that internationalization will promote eco-innovation among SMEs and in turn enhance their performance, competitive performance. So how well are our findings generalizable to other potential contexts? Because we did all of our studies in the context of Slovenia, and Slovenia is a transitional economy, yes, transitioning from a state-controlled socialist system to a market-driven system. It is also an innovation-driven economy, environmentally conscious. It is a small open economy and a member of a major trading bloc, the European Union. And as you can see on that chart to the left, Slovenia is performing quite well compared to the European Union average in the 2019 European Union Eco-Innovation Scoreboard. So what about other contexts? There is a study by Giuniati et al., more recent study, that also reports a significant mediating effect of eco-innovation on the relationship between internationalization and performance. And they have a sample of managers from Malaysian MNE, so a different country and much larger companies. And also Shumarakis et al. In a very in a monumental bibliometric analysis of over 1,600 studies that were published between 91 and 2020, they also present the internationalization, eco-innovation performance lift link in their summary and synthesis of the studies they reviewed. So we can say that that there is indeed a virtuous link between internationalization and eco-innovation, and that all leads to improved performance. So what are some policy implications from this research and from these studies? First of all, shifting the focus from supporting one-off eco-innovations to supporting the greening of the entire value chain, and better alignment of trade, environment, and sustainable development policies and regulations. This is something that is very much in the purview of the work of the World Trade Organization, the important work that the WTO is doing. Aligning regulations at the country level, regional, as well as at the supranational level. And last but not least, and that goes back to the nature of the environmental sector as being oligopolistic, fostering public-private partnerships that can allow trade and environment to be mutually supportive. So in sum, I would like to conclude that there is indeed a virtuous cycle between internationalization, eco-innovation, in that SMEs can learn from their internationalization and introduce eco-innovation throughout their value chains, while also finding good opportunities for export-led growth through their eco-innovation initiatives. And on this positive note, I would like to conclude my presentation so that I can leave time for any questions on this very, very important topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana, for that very interesting and comprehensive overview. I think it's a perspective that is increasingly important if we want to include a notion of inclusivity in this eco-innovation environment. So we have a number of questions in the chat or the Q&A. And let me start with a question for choices here. So I have to decide here. Yes, Professor Sinclair Desagnier. You mentioned the link between trade and EGS and environmental policy stringency. Could you say a little more about how environmental policy stringency is measured? This is a question from Basil Feller. Don't forget to unmute. There you go.
There I go. Sorry for that. There are some various ways to measure it. There are out there also several indices that exist, qualifying, the amount, the stringency of environmental policies. Some of them are based on results of such policies, right? On in certain key areas like greenhouse gases emissions. Others are based on subjective evaluations by firms or by some economic actors in those countries. And others are based on concrete specific regulations. And well, it's the main problem, but the question is a very valid question, because there are still, I would say, measurement problems about this. Yes. And also I would say, relating to what I said in my talk about the number of segments and the difference you may have, to have an overall measure of stringency doesn't make much sense. You would have to consider a specific sector, I would say, and yeah.
Okay, Bernard, thanks. Could I had made the transition from your talk to Tatiana's, and I'd mentioned this question about relatively outdated data. Are there more up-to-date statistics that show these trends over more recent years, and where might we find those? That's a question from Daria Taglioni.
Mhm. There are, but only partial ones. And data is a problem. This is why, I think one of the main benefits of I would say, concluding those negotiations on trade liberalization would be to agree, to be consensual on definitions and classifications and so on. Because again, yes, there are data, but data is partial. Data is often collected by private firms. Therefore, it is not so accessible and very expensive when you get it, and even then it could be could date a few years ago, and so that's a general problem, I would say. And this is why you don't see that many studies, empirical studies of that eco industry. They're rather rare in the literature because of this data problem.
It looks like there may also be a role there for governments or international organizations to try to find a way to gather that data and make it more available.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Tatiana, you mentioned that many factors can act as both barriers and drivers for SME eco-innovation. What do you think are the conditions that could help ensure those factors to act as drivers?
I think some of the most critical ones are regulations. Regulations are a double-edged sword, and Bernard very nicely illustrated that. But for SMEs, they're just particularly onerous because managerial time is such a valuable commodity and such a scarce resource in an SME. And they're also, depending on the institutional context, they can be a source of disappointment and also provide a lot of opportunities for toll collection along the way by more opportunistically minded public officials. So transparency in regulations and simplification of regulations, I believe, will have a very, very positive effect. Also, information. I want to back up absolutely what Bernard was saying about the role of data. While I was preparing for this presentation, it was not so easy to find even basic indicators of the export involvement of SMEs from emerging and developing countries. So there is so much data on SMEs in developed economies, but there is so much need to know more about and help the SMEs and the entrepreneurs in emerging and developing economies. And this is where there is a little bit of a gap in our understanding.
Well, maybe some colleagues from the World Bank may be able to help advance some of those efforts to build that capacity to collect the data. A question for Bernard again. This is from Ron Steenblick, formerly with OECD. Isn't there some overlap in your classification between equipment for, say, water treatment, water treating as a service, and water utilities?
I wouldn't say an overlap. I would say complementarity. They both go together, basically, because the equipment requires, I'd say it's a bit like a transportation mean. There's the equipment, but you need someone to drive it. And the same thing holds for water treatment or waste, especially waste management. Still, you need. Maybe it will change with AI, with artificial intelligence, that you will need less human beings so far. But waste management in particular is something that it's an activity that still requires, especially for in the sorting part and the waste collection part, waste recollection part. It's extremely, I would say, requires a lot of human power, to work.
Tatiana, a question for you. So actually a comment and then a question. One comment again from Mr. Steenblick is that innovation can come from different sources, not just eco-innovation. So he points out that these motion sensors for lighting were really developed to help improve building security. And I do think it's an interesting point that innovation can come from many different areas that have maybe not the intended consequences, but then we learn that they have pretty significant other benefits for eco-innovation. But the question from Sergio Martinez for you, Tatiana, what policies can enable public-private partnerships to deploy eco-innovation technologies for greening supply chains and increasing small business access to sustainability and sustainable development processes?
I think more education and better information on the opportunities for these partnerships, and perhaps some support with seed money and grant. A lot of corporations are very sensitive these days on their ESG performance, and this is a relatively uncomplicated thing to promote. So a lot of I see in the area of entrepreneurship, there are so many initiatives on educating entrepreneurs and providing exchanges. Open innovation, including eco-innovation, has been recognized as one of the critical avenues for the diffusion, promotion and diffusion of eco-innovations. But and again, small caveat there, it's not just about the creation of this value from innovation, but capturing the value. And this is where we have to be very careful about allowing the smaller players to get their due, to capture what the inadequate portion of the value that has been created.
A question, I think, for you, Bernard, from Sanjita Bansal. How can developing countries such as India take advantage of waste management technologies of the West?
That's a good question. I'd say there is a certainly there is a in the West there is a professionalization of the of waste treatment, something more systematic, something certainly more also, I would say also less dangerous for people's health, right? And I think in this respect, there are certainly some transfers that are not only possible but desirable. But one has to be careful also because waste. First of all, the composition of waste is very different. In developing countries, it's mostly organic waste, while in developed countries it's non-organic mostly. And so basically the associated technologies have to be different. But as I said, just to re-insist on this, I would say in the approach to waste and some of the way you work in collecting, sorting, treating waste, I think some transfers should be possible. The whole service in the whole service area, maybe not the hardware. I think the hardware would probably put a lot of people in developing countries out of a job, which is certainly not desirable, at least not in the short term. But in the service area, there are certainly some transfers that can be made in the know-how. Yeah.
Tatiana, do you want to weigh in on that? You've mentioned the lack of data in developing countries. And
yes, the lack of data of developing countries, but Bernard's discussion prompted me on the topic of reverse innovation and flipped innovation, because I think that in the treatment of waste and the recycling of waste, there are some interesting things that the developing world, which has been traditionally a lot more careful about recycling and about zero waste, and better use of resources, there's probably some opportunities for interesting business practices that can be transferred and implemented in around the world in other countries as well, including developed economies, even though if the composition of waste is different, but still there's probably opportunities to do that, and hence the need for more information, because we do not have this good understanding and appreciation of what is being done in India in terms of waste recycling or waste management techniques, or in Africa, or in countries in Africa, or in countries in Latin America. That would be very interesting and might provide some very interesting, fresh, and relatively more cost efficient for sure, ways to deal with these problems.
If I may also perhaps jump on this, speaking of know-how transfers, it could go both ways, I'd say, in terms of perhaps professionalism and perhaps health, more healthy practices. I think perhaps the developed countries have a lot, perhaps to a lot of transfers to be made to the developing countries. But in terms of the approach to waste and recycling and reuse, not much is wasted in the developing countries, right? They tend to reuse a lot more, especially in packaging. You know, our packaging is terrible in the developed world. The way what we do with it is terrible. They tend to be much more, I would say, frugal in that respect in developing countries, and perhaps there's some know-how that developed countries could get from them in that respect.
Bernard, Tatiana, our hour is up. Thank you for the marvelous presentations and the engagement with the questions and the exchanges between the two of you. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. I'd like to also thank Jose Antonio Montero for organizing this. He does great work. And to Victoria and Diana for making sure that it all worked when we got online. And yeah, very, very good teamwork. And I appreciate the work of the WTO team and our two speakers. Thank you very much and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.